Today we're talking about the Pittsburgh Steelers. This is team number 7 in the 10 and 20-minute NFL team series. So let's get right into it. There's a lot of ground to cover with the Pittsburgh Steelers. When last we saw them, another winning season under Mike Tomlin, 10-7, almost like smoke and mirrors. And they did it with an offense that was kind of vanilla with Matt Canada in charge as offensive coordinator. And finally, they severed ties with him at the end of the year. They went as far as they could. Kenny Pickett's gone. So a lot of changes as they try to jumpstart the offense. As far as the stat sheet, believe it or not, maybe people don't realize this, but they actually went 5-1 versus their tough AFC North rivals. I don't know if that's something that they can readily replicate, but that's what spurred them to that fantastic 10-7 season that they had last year. Another area that they may not be able to replicate is that plus 11 turnover ratio. With Russell Wilson coming in and Justin Fields coming in, they're not necessarily turnover-prone candidates, but plus 11 is very hard to replicate. So they're going to have to make up points by having a better roster. And I can tell you this, from finally having a top 5 draft class last year, 2023, to what they did in free agency just this past March and April, they do have a better roster. And that was before this draft that we're going to touch upon in just a couple of minutes. Who have they added? Looking at my sheet, they've added a couple wide receivers, not necessarily household names, in Watkins and Van Jefferson. They're more like wide receiver 3 type, so they certainly still needed a wide receiver. Obviously, they've added Russell Wilson and they've added Justin Fields, so the quarterback room is completely different. Patrick Queen comes over from rival Baltimore to the Pittsburgh Steelers, and I think that's a big acquisition in the middle. You guys, obviously, you still have Watt there to be the driving force, but Patrick Queen is definitely an above average acquisition at linebacker. And I'm trying to see if they've added anybody else that I have note. I don't believe, well, let's add Cordell Patterson in because of the new kick return rules. Cordell Patterson is the record holder in kick returns 24 hours after the new rules were put into place. Pittsburgh was proactive and they got somebody proven in this area, Cordell Patterson. So what a great find for Pittsburgh. So they've really elevated their roster, which they needed to do because as we talked about, that 10-7 was more smoke and mirrors. If you look by Pythagorean theorem principles, they were more like an 8.2 win team. So this roster will help compensate for that just a little bit. One other note before we get to the draft, and that's we need to talk about the new offensive coordinator, which is Arthur Smith. And Arthur Smith, boy, there are polarizing thoughts about him. As a coordinator at Tennessee, he kind of fits with what they want to do in Pittsburgh, and that's establish the run to get the play action pass going. They certainly don't want to put either Justin Fields or Russell Wilson in harm's way. We know they hold on to the ball a long time. We know that they've been sack prone. I think Arthur Smith wants to get that run game going. He's got a contract year out of their lead runner, Najee Harris. That usually bodes well. Najee Harris certainly wants to prove himself. He doesn't have a contract for the upcoming season. And they have Jaylen Warren back there, who had a very stout yards per carry. It's going to be interesting to see how Arthur Smith works out with this team. Let's go to their draft needs. And they lost Johnson in a trade for cornerback, Jackson for Johnson last year. So wide receiver is definitely a need. I believe, especially with Wilson and with Fields back there, whichever quarterback is there, they need extra help in the offensive line. And I'd like to see them add a little bit more cornerback and defensive back depth. And what they did is they nailed it again. This is another top 4 to 5 draft class, back-to-back years for Pittsburgh. This bodes well for their future. Obviously, it's a tough division right now. I'm not going to necessarily predict they're going to rise to the top of the AFC, but they've established a foundation that makes them competitive, not only 2024, but beyond that. Two offensive linemen right away, and a sleeper offensive lineman that can be groomed to play in the interior offensive line, guard or center, in Mason McCormick, who I actually do like, and he's fairly well rated for me as well. He had a 4th round grade for me in this particular draft class, and Fontanu out of Washington had a 1st round grade, draft slot 13 to 20. So obviously decent value there. And Zach Frazier had a 2nd round grade, 35 to 50. So well done at the top. Roman Wilson is penciled in as a starter. In fact, their top 3 draft choices are penciled in as starters. Maybe growing pains. It's hard to actually plug and play 2 offensive linemen right away. But again, as they gain experience, you're going to see an upgrade in the offensive line performance. Roman Wilson, savvy pass catcher. He'll be added to the mix. He'll have to contribute as best he can right away. Peyton Wilson is interesting because he has a number 1 linebacker draft grade on the interior for me with a double asterisk because he's had 4 off-season or in-season surgeries. He's relatively damaged goods on the floor level, but on the ceiling level, he is the best linebacker, or he was the best linebacker available in this particular draft. So I like the addition of Peyton Wilson. Great stab in the 4th round. Good value, especially since you filled needs with your first 3 picks. And then Logan Lee helps a lot. Ryan Watts, he was rated correctly. I gave him a 6th round grade, but I would have liked to see more cornerback or defensive back depth. But other than that, maybe another wide receiver, because I don't know if Roman Wilson, I don't think he's a number 2 right out of the gate. So they have a bunch of number 3 wide receivers, plus George Pickens, who's going to be an asset to Russell Wilson and Justin Fields, as I'll explain at the end. So it's not a bad draft class by any means. Divisional outlook, season win outlook. Okay, so their season wins is roughly, well, it opened 7.5. It got as high as 180. Then it started ticking up once you saw what was going on in free agency. And right before the draft, we actually saw season win totals of 8.5, and it was minus 135 to the over. And that was a little too ambitious, I thought. And then after we saw the schedule release, which is just brutal, we saw the 8.5 still there, but now it's slanted definitely to the under. So we've seen wild shifts in just a month between the 7.5 rising all the way up to minus 180. There's still 7.5s out there. The 8.5 now is more or less plus money. No recommendation from me at this time. I've done kind of a win grid. We're going to talk about the schedule. I think the number is properly priced. We have on the divisional odds as high at DraftKings as plus 850. Steep hill to climb when you're talking about Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, and Baltimore. Again, no recommendation as well. Here are my final thoughts and my keys to this season. Number 1, first of all, final thought, the roster is clearly better than it was in January. Through this draft, 3 starters, also Peyton Wilson at linebacker, through free agency, whatever you think is left out of Russell Wilson or Justin Fields becoming the heir apparent, I think they improved their room there. Now, how Russell Wilson does with this offensive line, that's going to be up to Arthur Smith. So I don't have the answers right now. I have more questions than answers as far as Arthur Smith. But I think best case scenario is George Pickens makes the contested catch. Roman Wilson has that ability. Van Jefferson has that ability. These are quarterbacks that improvise a lot, Russell Wilson and Justin Fields. If they're not the Brett Favre, or I shouldn't say Brett Favre, they're not the Aaron Rodgers, they're not the Tom Brady's, they're not the Peyton Mannings, where they tell you, even Joe Burrow, they tell you, if I ask you to run a 10-yard route, you better run that 10-yard route. This is more or less get open. We're going to scramble in the pocket. We're going to make things happen, and we're going to throw it to you. And your large body, whether it be the 2 tight ends on the roster that can do this, or whether it be George Pickens. They have that ability to snatch the ball out of the air. So it's a good quarterback wide receiver fit. The question is, can Arthur Smith continue to have success on the ground to open up the passes? And can Russell Wilson maybe a little bit less of his ego and a little bit more being willing and able to adapt to the system and throw a little bit faster so he's not sacked as much as he has been the last 4, 5, 6 years? Let's talk about the schedule. It's brutal the last 8 games of the year. They do not even play anybody in the AFC North the first 10 games. So it's crazy. That means all these new pieces have to come together, including the coordinator, right away, because the last 8 games are home and away against Baltimore, home and away against Cincinnati, home and away against Cleveland in tough conditions, probably tough weather conditions, and they have to play Philadelphia, and they have to play Kansas City. That's as brutal a schedule as I've seen for any team in the last 8 games, and that's going to be hard to overcome. So basically, the early key for me is, how is that offensive chemistry? Can it get together? Can it work as fast as possible? And of course, I'll add another key because it's always a key, and that is keep Watt healthy. When he misses games, the defense doesn't have to key on him. And we've seen many, many more losses than wins without Watt in the lineup. So keep him healthy as well. Tomorrow, I have one podcast, and that's going to be with Kyle Hunter and the Cincinnati Bengals. We're going to close up the AFC North division, and we're going to close it out with the Cincinnati Bengals, the return of Joe Burrow. All of my videos are available on YouTube. Subscribe, like, comment on them. Anything you'd like to see, any questions you have, I will answer them on YouTube. Thanks again for watching this 10-minute preview of the Pittsburgh Steelers. What a great roster they're building, but it's going to be a struggle in the tough AFC North and against that brutal eight-game stretch. No recommendations at this time, but a lot of good things to look for as we head into 2024. I will see you tomorrow with the Cincinnati Bengals.